The sensor log showed a teacup. Not wreckage, not a weapon signature, not the electromagnetic ghost of a drive system spinning down. A teacup, ceramic, white, with a small painted flower along the rim, floating in the exact geometric center of the space where Admiral Voskareth's entire Third Armada had been anchored 47 minutes earlier. 412 warships. Gone. The teacup rotated slowly in the void, unhurried, as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if someone had wanted it to be found. Sensor analyst Vor stared at the readout for 11 seconds before she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet. Archive this, all of it, and find me whoever was aboard that station. She did not say what she was afraid of. She didn't need to. Every officer on the bridge of the Dominion survey vessel *Constant Reason had already seen the same thing she had. The teacup was still warm. 3 hours earlier, the demand had been simple. The Keth Dominion did not issue ultimatums. That was a distinction their diplomatic corps made repeatedly, and with great pride. The Dominion issued corrections. A correction was an opportunity for a less developed civilization to align with galactic consensus before consequences became structural. It was, by every measure the Dominion used to evaluate itself, a generous gesture. The correction delivered to humanity's Joint Governance Council at 900 station time had contained 4 paragraphs. The first established the Dominion's legal authority over disputed boundary space. The second detailed the resource extraction licenses humanity had violated. The third specified the terms of cessation. The fourth, and here the language became precise in the particular way that diplomatic language becomes precise when it is trying not to say the word asterisk or else, outlined what the Dominion's Third Armada would begin doing in 48 hours if those terms were not met. 412 warships. The largest single-force projection in Dominion history, assembled not because humanity was considered a serious military threat, but because the Dominion's Strategic Calculus Division had run the numbers and determined that overwhelming presence reduced the probability of inefficient resistance from any species, regardless of capability level. Humanity had 37 ships in the region, aging ones. The Council's reply arrived in 19 minutes. Not 48 hours, 19 minutes. Fleet Coordinator Vashdem, who had been assigned to monitor the communication channel during what everyone expected to be a waiting period, almost missed it. She had been reading a secondary report. When the alert chimed, she set the report down slowly, reread the message header twice, and then opened it with the particular careful attention of someone who suspects they may have made a computational error somewhere. The message was 4 words. "We need more time." Vashdem exhaled. This was not unusual. Species always requested more time. It was almost biologically universal. When faced with an overwhelming force, every known civilization's first response was to try to slow the clock, extend the window, find a negotiating surface somewhere in the geography of the timeline. She marked the message received, noted the timestamp, and began composing the standard Dominion reply explaining that the 48-hour window was not subject to modification. She never finished composing it. Because the human response, the actual response, not the request for time, arrived 11 minutes later. It was not a surrender. It was not a counterproposal. It was a question. Which specific articles of the Interstellar Commerce Accords, subsection 14, paragraphs 3 through 9, do you believe were violated? Please cite the relevant survey boundary documentation. Vashdem read it twice. Then she forwarded it to the Legal Interpretation Division with a note that said simply, "Confirm that we have this." The thing that no one in the Dominion Strategic Calculus Division had accounted for, could not have accounted for, because no species they had ever encountered had done it, was that humanity had apparently spent the 19 minutes between receiving the correction and sending their first message doing legal research. Not panicking, not mobilizing, not preparing a dramatic response signal. Research. They're stalling, said Deputy Coordinator Hesak Prill, when the legal interpretation report came back 3 hours later with the uncomfortable finding that the boundary documentation the Dominion had cited was, in fact, contested under a treaty signed 40 years ago that humanity had technically been a non-signatory observer to, which created an ambiguous but not entirely dismissible claim on their part. This is a delay tactic. Of course it is, Vashdem agreed. Neither of them asked what humans were delaying asterisk for asterisk. The answer seemed obvious. They were buying time to attempt evacuation, or to signal for help, or to make their 37 aging ships look more intimidating than they were. Species always did one of those three things. The third Armada held position. Fleet Admiral Voskareth, commanding from his flagship, the asterisk absolute standard asterisk, sent back a reply nodding that legal objections did not pause the operational timeline. Humanity sent another question 40 minutes later. This one was about insurance. Specifically, about whether the Dominion's correction constituted a formal declaration of hostile intent under the Galactic Commerce Authority's trade disruption protocols, and if so, whether the GCA's arbitration window, which, under those protocols, was mandatory and ran to 72 hours, superseded the Dominion's 48-hour timeline. Hesak Prill read this and felt something he could not immediately name. It was not quite respect. It was more like the feeling of reaching for something on a shelf and discovering the shelf was 12 centimeters higher than you remembered. They know GCA procedure, he said. Apparently. How do they know GCA procedure? They've been spacefaring for what, 90 years? Vashdem didn't answer. She was already pulling up humanity's file, looking for something she had not thought to look for before. Some context for why a species with 37 aging warships and less than a century of space travel was responding to an existential threat by citing subsection arbitration windows. She found something, buried in the cultural analysis section, that the strategic calculus team had apparently not weighted heavily. Humans had, on their own single planet, maintained approximately 10,000 distinct legal traditions simultaneously for several millennia. They had spent the majority of their recorded history in constant, overlapping conflict with each other, and had developed the art of procedural delay, treaty interpretation, and jurisdictional argument to a degree that most Dominion legal scholars would have considered baroque if they'd ever bothered to look. They weren't stalling to buy time to run. They were stalling because delay was asterisk their weapon. And the Third Armada, operating on a 48-hour clock, had just had 22 hours eaten by mandatory GCA arbitration protocol that even the Dominion couldn't legally dismiss without triggering a separate crisis with the Commerce Authority. Tell me, said Hesak Prill very carefully, that we have someone actually tracking what's in our boundary documentation. Vashdem was already on a second channel. Her expression told him everything before she spoke. 3 of the survey markers they're disputing, she said, were filed by a contractor who was subsequently delicensed for falsification. The silence on the bridge lasted 4 seconds. How long have they known that? Unknown, she paused, but they cited the delicensing date in their arbitration filing. Hesak Prill stood up from his station. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the arrangement of the Armada, 412 ships, the largest force projection in Dominion history, and tried to reconcile the scale of it with the image of a species that had spent the last several hours doing archival research on Dominion contractor licensing records. What are they doing right now, he asked. Actually doing, not legally, physically. No one answered immediately, because no one had thought to track it. When they did check, when they pulled the long-range observation data that had been accumulating without anyone reviewing it, The answer was strange enough that Vashdem asked for it to be rerun twice before she believed it. 26 of humanity's 37 ships had moved, not away, not toward the Armada. Sideways, into a configuration that didn't match any standard defensive formation in the Dominion's threat assessment database. They were spread across a volume of space that made no tactical sense for a defensive posture, too dispersed to support each other, too spread to form a perimeter. "What is that formation?" HFY asked. The tactical officer, a young Keth named Oris Ivan who had graduated top of her class at the Dominion War College, studied it for a long moment. "I don't know," she said. "It doesn't match anything." The human on the other end of the GCA arbitration channel was named Coordinator Ilara Voss. No relation to the Dominion's fleet admiral. The name coincidence would not be noted until much later, when people were trying to reconstruct the sequence of events and kept finding small details that seemed, in retrospect, either meaninglessly coincidental or deeply intentional, and couldn't always tell the difference. Ilara Voss was 44 years old. She had spent the previous decade working in resource dispute arbitration for the Jupiter Collective, which was a set of mining operations that had spent 30 years in constant legal conflict with 3 separate Earth-based corporate conglomerates, and had never once been forced into an unfavorable settlement. She had been pulled from that role 8 months ago, assigned to the Joint Governance Council's newly formed Diplomatic Interface Division, and told, in terms that the director of the division clearly found uncomfortable, that her particular skill set might become relevant. She had apparently been preparing for this conversation since then. The GCA arbitration officer, a male named Chairperson Duv Sok, had been running boundary dispute arbitrations for 60 years and had never once had a session go beyond the standard procedural opening before one side or the other began making concessions. The process was, in the Dominion's experience of it, a formality, a cooling-off window dressed in the language of law. Ilara Voss treated it like a trial. She called witnesses, Dominion witnesses, experts in Keth boundary survey law who had written the foundational texts, whose names were on the licensing frameworks, who could not without professional self-destruction claim that the 3 falsified survey markers were valid. She filed evidence packages. She cited precedents that Chairperson Duv Sok had himself authored 20 years ago in different contexts. She was, throughout, extraordinarily polite. She was also, Duv Sok noted in his private log that evening, the most dangerous person he had ever encountered in an arbitration room. Not because she was aggressive, because she was patient asterisk, because she had clearly identified before she walked into the room exactly how many hours she needed, and she was going to use every procedural mechanism available to get them. He found himself wondering, around the 6-hour mark, what she was buying time for. He found himself wondering, around the 9th hour, whether he should be more worried about her answer or the Dominion's. At the 11-hour mark, Ilara Voss requested a procedural recess, citing documentation review requirements under GCA Statute 7.4. He granted it. She walked out of the arbitration chamber, found a quiet alcove, and sat down against the wall with her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked at the ceiling for 30 seconds. Then she took out a small ceramic mug, white, with a painted flower along the rim, filled it from a thermos she carried in her bag, and drank tea. Her hands were shaking slightly. She drank until they stopped. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked back in. The formation wasn't defensive. Oris Ivan figured it out at hour 14, and when she did, she wished she hadn't. "It's not a battle formation," she said, pulling the display up for HFY. "Look at the spacing. They're not positioned to fight. They're positioned to see asterisk. These vectors, each ship has an unobstructed line of observation to a different section of the Armada. Full coverage. They're watching us." "Watching us for what?" "Every movement, every drive signature, every time we redirect power. She highlighted a cluster of data points. These 3 ships, they've been running constant passive scan cycles since they moved into position, not active scans. Passive. We wouldn't flag passive scans as hostile. We've been generating 14 hours of behavioral data and handing it to them. HFY looked at the formation again, at the elegant, dispersed geometry of it that he had initially read as tactical incompetence. "They're learning our patterns," he said. "They've already learned them." She pulled up the timestamps. "Look, 7 hours ago they could predict our standard rotation cycle within a 4-second margin. 3 hours ago within 1 second. They know exactly how we move. They know our response latency. They know which ships reposition first when we shift to threat posture. They have 37 ships. We have 412. Yes, Oris Ivan said it without inflection, and the flatness of it was the most unsettling thing HFY had heard all day. They know that too. He turned away from the display. He needed to think, and thinking was becoming difficult, because every new piece of information was arriving attached to a question he didn't have an answer to, and the questions were accumulating faster than he could process them. What were humans doing with 14 hours of Dominion behavioral data and 37 aging ships? What had they been doing for the past 8 months, since the Dominion's diplomatic survey had first identified the boundary dispute and flagged it for resolution? Why had a species with no serious military capability appointed a resource arbitration specialist? Not a diplomat, not a military officer, a * resource arbitration specialist as their primary interface. And underneath all of it, the question he couldn't quite bring himself to ask out loud. Why don't they seem afraid? The answer to that question, the real answer, not the one that HFY's stress-narrowed thinking would have generated, was sitting in a classified file that the Joint Governance Council had sealed 8 months ago and had not opened since. The file was titled, in the bureaucratic shorthand of people who needed to refer to it quickly without saying it plainly, Project Patience *. Its full title in the internal documentation was Asymmetric Deterrence Framework for Pre-Peer Conflict Scenarios, a doctrinal foundation for survival against existential force projection *. It had been written by a retired military strategist named Commander Yale Ben David, who had spent 30 years before retirement studying every recorded instance of asymmetric conflict in human history. Not the famous ones, not the battles that showed up in textbooks, but the obscure ones. The insurgencies that lasted 30 years against occupying empires. The sieges that ended because the besieging army ran out of food before the besieged city did. The naval campaigns won not through superior firepower, but through superior knowledge of local weather patterns. The political negotiations that destroyed alliances through patience when no weapon could have touched them. Ben David's central argument, laid out in the document's executive summary, was deceptively simple. A species that cannot win a direct engagement does not need to win a direct engagement. It needs only to make the cost of victory higher than the value of what is being won. The specific mechanisms were detailed across 412 pages. HFY would never read them. Neither would Fleet Admiral Voskerath. But someone had clearly read them very carefully, because in the 8 months since the Dominion survey had flagged humanity's boundary dispute, a very precise sequence of events had been quietly set in motion. The arbitration, the formation, the data collection, the legal documentation that had taken 8 months to compile, cross-reference, and prepare for deployment in a 12-hour window. And the piece HFY didn't know about yet. The piece that was already in motion. "Tell me the GCA decision timeline," Fleet Admiral Voskerath said. He had been silent for the last 3 hours, reading reports, and his silence had been the kind that lowered the ambient temperature of a room. Chairperson Duvsock could rule within 6 hours of the recess ending, Voshdem said. If he rules in humanity's favor on the boundary markers, the disputed territory reverts to contested status, which means our resource extraction license claim is invalidated, which means the entire basis for the correction. Doesn't matter, said Voskareth. We proceed regardless. The Armada is already here. We proceed. Vashdem paused. Sir, if we proceed against an active GCA arbitration ruling, we trigger Article 19. Every GCA member state is obligated to impose trade sanctions. That's 64 species. Political consequences are not my concern. Military outcomes are. With respect, sir, the Third Armada's operational cost over a 6-month deployment requires resupply chains that run through 4 GCA member states. If those routes are sanctioned. Vashdem. Yes, sir. Find me something to hit. She went back to her station. Oris Ivan caught her eye and said nothing. There was nothing to say. When a fleet admiral wanted something to hit, you found him something to hit, and you noted in your private log that you had raised concerns, and you hoped very hard that the thing you found him to hit did not turn out to have been a very carefully selected target. The 11 ships that had stayed back, the ones that hadn't joined the observation formation, were the piece Hesakpril hadn't asked about. He should have asked about them. He would think about that later, in the way that you think about a very small thing that turned out to be very important, with a specific, exhausting clarity. The 11 ships were old, genuinely old by any standard. 3 of them were 50 years past their designed operational lifespan, kept running by what the Dominion's technical assessment had called, in a brief notation, *improvised maintenance solutions*, which was the closest the assessors had come to writing. We don't understand how these are still flying. They were not, in any conventional sense, a threat. They were positioned, and here was the thing, here was the detail that mattered, at the 11 precise gravitational resonance points that the 14 hours of observation data had identified as the Third Armada's preferred repositioning nodes, the specific locations that Dominion Fleet Doctrine specified for rapid redeployment under threat conditions. Not blocking them, nothing so obvious. Just present. Old, barely functional ships, sitting in positions that had no tactical logic unless you understood that their presence there would force the Armada to use secondary repositioning vectors, which were slower, which would extend response time by approximately 4 minutes per major maneuver. 4 minutes. It seemed like nothing. It seemed like an irrelevance, a footnote, the kind of marginal factor that got lost in the noise of a fleet engagement. Oris Ivan understood what it meant at the same moment the first alert came in. She stood up from her station. They're not positioning to fight us, she said. Hesakpril turned. They're positioning us, she said, to be somewhere specific. The second alert came in before she finished the sentence. The GCA arbitration ruling arrived 47 minutes before the operational window closed. It ruled in humanity's favor on all 3 disputed survey markers. It was not the ruling that mattered. The ruling was the signal. The 11 ships, receiving a burst transmission on a frequency that the Dominion's passive monitoring hadn't flagged, because it was within the background radiation range of a pulsar 4 light-years distant. And wasn't that an interesting piece of prior planning? Executed a simultaneous precision jump. Not away. Through the Armada. 11 ships, moving in a precisely choreographed sequence that the 14 hours of behavioral data had made possible, jumped through the specific gaps in the Armada's formation that Dominion Standard Doctrine opened during the particular threat response posture that Fleet Admiral Voskareth had ordered 3 minutes ago when the ruling came in, and he'd said, loudly enough for the bridge to hear, "Begin threat posture Alpha." 11 ships that were 50 years past their operational lifespan, carrying no functioning weapons systems worth the name, executing a jump pattern that had been calculated to the meter based on 14 hours of watching how the Armada moved. They emerged on the far side, every ship intact. That was Mystery 1. The Dominion's drives, military grade, newest generation, had a minimum safe distance for formation jumps. The gaps that the 11 ships had used were too narrow, should have been too narrow. Dominion engineering doctrine established those minimums, and the doctrine was built on 300 years of physics. What Yvonne was looking at should not have been possible. How, she said, and it wasn't quite a question. The answer came 3 minutes later, when a technical analyst on the asterisk absolute standard pulled the telemetry from the 11 ships' jump signatures and found something that made her file a priority report with hands that weren't entirely steady. The jumps were rough, not precision engineered, not smooth. They were asterisk brutal, the kind of jump signature associated with drives being pushed past rated limits, the kind that left a ship's structural integrity in a condition that any responsible engineer would describe as asterisk significantly compromised asterisk. 3 of the 11 ships were venting atmosphere. 2 more had drive systems that the telemetry suggested were unlikely to function again without complete overhaul. The humans had jumped through the Armada, knowing their ships might not survive it. Knowing it, calculating for it, accepting it as an outcome. And they'd done it anyway. Why? HFY asked, and this time he wasn't asking rhetorically. He was asking because he genuinely did not understand, and not understanding was beginning to feel like the most frightening thing in the room. Yvonne pulled up the position data. The 11 ships, 8 fully functional, 3 in various states of distress, had emerged on the far side of the Armada and immediately taken up new positions. Positions that, combined with the 26 ships still in observation formation, completed a geometric shape around the Armada. Complete encirclement. 37 ships. The Armada had 412. The encirclement was, by any rational military calculus, meaningless. A gesture. You didn't encircle a force 11 times your size with ships that were barely flying. What are they doing with it? HFY said. They can't hold us. They have to know they can't hold us. Yvonne was quiet for a moment. Pull up the GCA ruling, she said. The full text. He did. She pointed to a section 3 paragraphs, in that his eyes had moved over without stopping. He read it. He read it again. Article 19 of the GCA Charter, which he had heard Vashdem cite earlier, sanctioned member states for offensive action against parties protected by active arbitration. It was the version of that article he knew, the one that had always been the relevant one. Article 19, subsection 3, clause 7, which he had never read because it had never been relevant, sanctioned member states for offensive action against parties who had requested arbitration protection and been denied by a militarily superior force, regardless of the final ruling outcome. Humanity had filed for that protection. The Dominion had technically denied it by not standing down the Armada during the arbitration window. That had already created the sanctionable event. The ruling just made it impossible to argue otherwise. But Clause 7 had a secondary provision, one that only activated if there was documented evidence of the militarily superior force maintaining offensive posture after the ruling. The encirclement was the documentation. 37 ships, some barely holding together, surrounding 412, not to fight them, not to hold them, to witness them, to ensure that every passive scan, every telemetry record, every drive signature and weapons system status from the next 47 minutes of Dominion Armada behavior would be transmitted in real time to the GCA arbitration record. Humans had turned their entire fleet into a recording device. The Armada couldn't attack without the attack being documented. It couldn't leave without the retreat being documented. It could hold position, and every minute it held position, it was accumulating a sanctionable record that grew more damaging with each passing second. 412 warships, caught in a legal trap laid by 37 ships and an arbitration specialist who had spent 11 hours in a room drinking tea. They planned this, HFY said, all of it from the first message. 8 months, Oresivan said, at least. They had 37 ships, and they were never going to fight us. No. They were going to cost us. Oresivan said nothing. She didn't need to. The numbers were already running, sanctions from 64 GCA member states, resupply route closures, the political fallout of a forced retreat. The precedent it set in every future Dominion correction against any species that had even cursory familiarity with galactic legal frameworks. It was going to cost the Dominion more to stay than the disputed territory was worth, by a factor HFY could not calculate quickly enough to make it feel real. Fleet Admiral Voskareth was given the analysis. He read it twice. He ordered the Armada to stand down. 412 warships, in the largest single-force projection in Dominion history, began the process of departing a volume of space they had held for 47 minutes. Procedural War found the teacup 6 hours later, when the survey vessel Constant Reason was dispatched to document the withdrawal. It was floating in the center of the space the Armada had occupied. White ceramic, small painted flower, still faintly warm from the heat retention of whatever liquid had recently been inside it. She logged it, object of unknown origin, civilian manufacture, recovered from operational zone, no strategic significance. She almost left it at that. What made her write the additional notation, the one that got pulled out of the archive 3 years later and read into the record at the Dominion Strategic Reassessment Commission, was that she recognized the style of the flower. It matched the insignia of the Jupiter Collective, the resource arbitration operation, the one that had spent 30 years in constant legal conflict with Earth-based corporations and had never once been forced into an unfavorable settlement, the one that had trained Ilara Voss. Someone had put it there deliberately, placed it in the exact center of the space where 412 warships had been before walking away, because they had been confident enough in the outcome to plant the evidence of their presence before the outcome was confirmed. And this was the thought that kept Procedural War awake for 3 nights afterward, they had placed it there as a message, not to the Dominion's analysts, not to the GCA arbitration record, to anyone in any civilization who might someday need to understand what had happened in that stretch of empty space. We were here, we knew you were coming, we were never afraid of you. The Commission report, 3 years later, described the incident in language that tried very hard to be clinical and did not entirely succeed. It noted that humanity had identified the boundary dispute 8 months before the Dominion's correction, and had spent those 8 months building a legal case, training a negotiator, collecting contractor licensing records, studying GCA procedural law, and developing a fleet positioning doctrine that required no weapon more advanced than a passive scan array. It noted that humanity's 37 ships, the assets that strategic calculus had dismissed as irrelevant to the military calculation, had been deployed not to fight, but to ensure that the relevant information reached the relevant institutions at the precisely relevant moment. It noted that 3 of the 11 ships that had jumped through the Armada had been subsequently decommissioned due to structural damage. Their crews had known the risk. Command records showed they had been given the option to withdraw and had declined. When HFY, called to testify, was asked why he thought the crews had accepted that risk, he was quiet for a long moment. Because, he said finally, they understood that if they didn't complete the encirclement, everything else fell apart. The whole framework required all 11 ships in position, and they understood. He stopped, started again. They understood that the math said it was a better outcome for those crews to take that risk than for the mission to fail. They accepted the possibility of death for a procedural maneuver. Yes. For a legal strategy. Yes. The commission member who had been asking the questions looked down at her notes. When she looked up, her expression was something between professional neutrality and a thing she was not trained to categorize. "Did you consider," she said, "at any point during those 47 minutes that the humans might win?" Hesakpril thought about the formation he had misread as tactical incompetence, the arbitration he had dismissed as a delay tactic, the 11 ships he had not asked about, the teacup no one had noticed until it was the only thing left. "No," he said. "Why not?" He looked at his hands. "Because they only had 37 ships," he said, "and we had 412. He paused. "That was the only number we looked at." The report's final section contained a recommendation, classified, not released to the general galactic record for another decade, that the Dominion Strategic Calculus Division be restructured to include a new assessment category. Not military capability, not technological level, not population mass or industrial output. The category was listed in the recommendation as willingness to continue under irrational conditions. The subnotation explained that most species, when faced with existential threat, performed a calculation. When that calculation returned a negative outcome, the species adjusted its behavior, surrendered, retreated, negotiated from a position of acknowledged weakness. Humans, the notation observed, appeared to perform the same calculation, and then do something that no model in the Dominion's library had been built to predict. They found a way to change what the calculation was measuring. Ilara Voss received no public recognition for what happened in that volume of space. The nature of what had been done did not lend itself to celebration. It had been too quiet, too procedural, too dependent on the absence of violence to make for a satisfying story in any conventional sense. She went back to Jupiter collective arbitration work 6 weeks later. Her replacement at the Diplomatic Interface Division was a man named Dr. Kwame Asant, who had spent the last 15 years in comparative legal systems research, and who arrived with 12 crates of documents. Before she handed over her files, she gave him one piece of advice. "They will always count their ships," she said. "They will count their weapons and their soldiers and their tonnage and their drive ratings, and then they will compare those numbers to ours and they will make a decision based on the comparison." She looked at him steadily. "Don't let them count the right things. That's the whole job." Asant thought about that for a moment, and the teacup. She had sent it to him specifically. He had asked about it in his first message. "A reminder," she said. "Of what?" She was already walking away. She answered without turning around. "That we were patient enough to wait for the moment, and we knew it when it came." Prathik Vor kept her copy of the sensor log. The original, not the archived version. The raw telemetry file that showed the teacup rotating slowly in the exact geometric center of where 412 warships had been. She looked at it sometimes, late in long shifts, when the asterisk constant reason was between assignments, and the void outside was quiet enough that a person could think clearly. She was not a philosopher. She was a sensor analyst, trained in the very practical art of measuring things that existed and reporting their measurements accurately. She did not, as a professional habit, draw large conclusions from small data points. But she had been thinking about the teacup for 3 years, and she had arrived at something she could not call a conclusion. It was more like a weight that had settled into a specific location in her understanding and would not move. The thing that troubled her was not what the humans had done. What they had done was, in hindsight, logical, elegant, even a precise deployment of the specific advantages available to them, executed with patience and precision, and a willingness to accept costs that still made her uncomfortable to think about. What troubled her was the moment before, the 19 minutes between the correction arriving and the first response being sent. What had happened in those 19 minutes, in the rooms where human decision-makers had read an ultimatum from 412 warships and then, instead of panicking, had opened legal databases? What did it feel like, she wondered, to look at something that enormous and immediately start looking for the mechanism to defeat it? What did it feel like to be the species that, when faced with an impossible calculation, had apparently decided generations ago that the correct response was to change the variables? She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure anyone did, not even the humans themselves, who seemed to treat their own refusal to stop as something unremarkable, a simple fact of their nature that required no explanation. The teacup sat in a sealed evidence container in her personal quarters, still white, small painted flowers still visible on the rim. Still warm, she sometimes thought, though she knew that was impossible. The warmth had to have dissipated long ago. But some part of her remained convinced, in the irrational and persistent way of a thing that refuses to be argued away, that something of the human who had placed it there, some residue of the particular quality of certainty that had made it possible to set down a cup of tea in the void before the outcome was decided, had not entirely faded. That it was still there, patient, waiting to be understood. The galaxy, it was becoming clear to those who studied these things carefully, had made the same mistake with humanity that the Dominion's strategic calculus division had made. It had counted the ships. It had measured the weapons and calculated the tonnage and assessed the drive ratings and compared the numbers. It had performed the calculation correctly by every standard it knew how to apply. What it had not accounted for, could not have accounted for, had no category for, had never needed a category for until now, was the species that looked at an impossible calculation, and then, quietly, without announcement or drama, sat down in an alcove with shaking hands and a thermos of tea, and decided to change what was being measured. Not the strongest, not the largest, not the most advanced. The species that had decided, somewhere in the long and brutal and unremarkable process of becoming itself, that enough was not a concept that applied to them. That the point at which a rational civilization stopped was simply where they began looking for a different door. And the worst part, the thing that HFY War could not articulate and could not stop thinking about, the thing that had kept her returning to the sensor log for 3 years without knowing exactly why, was that they didn't seem to know it was remarkable. They had placed a teacup in the void and walked away, because of course they had, because to them it was simply the appropriate gesture for the moment, a small human detail left behind in the space where something large had been decided. As if they had always known they would win. As if the only question had ever been what it would cost. And whether the cost was worth it. It always was.